My name's Adam Keul, and this is my redone version of the talk that I gave last Thursday for the Museum of the White Mountains that was unfortunately interrupted due to basically rural internet. So I got about halfway through it. So perhaps thank you to those who suffered through that at least. And a little bit of this may be review to some of you, but I will get a chance to finish it and finish my story about a more civilized wild power and purpose in White Mountains cartography. Please bear with me. This is my first attempt to record a Zoom lecture, but I did a practice and I think I've figured it out. So without further ado, let me share my screen. And here we go. Share. All right. I've noticed there's kind of a lag here, so I'm going to try to keep everything all in chronological order at least so that you can stay with me. So my name is Adam Keul. I'm a tourism geographer here at Plymouth State, and while I'm not a cartographer, I'm definitely a cartophile. You can see flags in my office, but it's also covered with maps as well. And I've always been attracted to cartography, and I've always loved the Museum of the White Mountains for its focus. We have so many great maps there, and I loved working with this exhibit throughout this year, including my earlier talk about a similar topic. But at this point, I'm going to focus very specifically on the maps. And my goal here is to illustrate, I'm certainly not looking at all of the maps. I'm being very selective, but I feel like the ones that I've chosen are pretty representative and important maps historically. My goal is to sort of illustrate what the maps are telling in the long run, what they're telling visitors about what New Hampshire is. It's hard for us to imagine not being able to see a picture of a place before we went, but by all means that was the case in the 19th century and 18th century as well, and all before. And so for many people, a map may have been sort of a surrogate for a picture in the long run, and especially if we talk about before the White Mountain School of landscape painting, a map may have been the only visual representation of New Hampshire that people had. And so cartographers took this power meaningfully, and they used it to begin essentially a story of a world that was both on the edge of wilderness, natural, untamed, but also one that was incredibly opulent and tamed. And I've chosen this picture for the background to sort of illustrate that, because you see this beautiful hotel and a modern steam train, yet it's juxtaposed next to Mount Madison with all the hatchers that sort of give you this this daunting image. And this is from the Boardman map that I'll talk about a little bit more at the very end. So to continue, a lot of my research and work is really, I write more theoretical, but rather than digging a bunch of theory into all of this, I'm just going to make a few statements on the power of maps. And geographers have spent hundreds of years discussing. I think that the most important general conclusion that we've come to about maps is that they are a source of power, and in many ways they make spaces, right? Doreen Massey's one of my favorite geographers, really about the role of geography in general and globalization, but also maps specifically. In For Space, she says that maps and cartography in general, through their codes and conventions and their taxonomic and ordering procedures, they operate as a technology of power. And it may sound strange to think of a map as a technology, but by all means, this is a new way of an evolving technology, a way of looking at the world that is, though, created by people who have a particular vision of the world and have intention in the representations that they are making. She also says that earlier cartography attempts to grasp, to invent a vision of the whole, to tame confusion and complexity. And I use that quote because in many ways that's a direct reference, or not reference, it's a direct you know, comparison to what I'm claiming is going on in these maps. Not only are we inventing a vision of what the White Mountains was, but taking a complex vision and making it more simple, but always within the framework of power at the same time. So I want to introduce a few basic concepts. There's no test, no notes are needed, but a couple of ideas that I think are important for the audience to understand before I start using them. The first is just the idea of representation in general. And representation is a sign or symbol that stands in for something. Just like right behind me, the flags, they're a representation of a place. They're a symbol that stands for Benin and Canada behind my shoulders. But really a picture is a representation. You could write a book about a place as a representation, a video, and of course cartography is also, and really all the cartography and pictures and writing are a representation of space. And so spatial representation is really the act of making a symbol, a visual symbol for something that is spatial, not just something in general. The second concept comes loosely out of Edward Said's work on Orientalism that was taken up by geographers as the creation of imagined geographies. And imagined geographies are very simple, a simple thing to understand. It's basically what we think about a place. We also call them geographic imaginaries. And again, it's not because they are pretend, it's just because they are part of our imagination, right? It's not imaginary pretend. Those are just perceptions of space. Where do they come from? They're created through representations, images of places, texts about places, discourse or sort of stories about places. And I like to add that experience itself also influences our imagined geographies, because if we've been somewhere, we don't remember every single moment of it. We have our own sort of creative imagination of it. So those are my basic ideas, and I will be rolling with them. The questions I really want to answer are, what are the imagined geographies of the White Mountains, at least in a really general sense? Where did they come from? And what role did early cartography play in fashioning the imagined geographies of the White Mountains? So what I have to suggest here is a binary, because I find it to be one of the most attractive parts about the White Mountains. And I first noticed it when I was in this very building, in the Mount Washington Hotel. I was standing on the back porch looking at Mount Washington, and I thought, wow, isn't this incredible that you have this significant mountain that at the time looked a lot like this. It was sort of October, beautiful, diverse, wild in many senses. Yet if I turn around 180 degrees, behind me is one of the most elegant and opulent environments I've ever been in. And that juxtaposition of what I'm calling wild and civilized is what I think that that comes out of early cartography, and especially out of tourist focused maps. So when I say wild, what do I mean? I mean the sense of wild both in human and in natural wild. So the human wild is kind of what we imagine when we say Wild West, right? Like it's chaotic and crazy and perhaps dangerous, right? Whereas the natural wild, that's pretty straightforward, right? A world that wasn't expressly manufactured by people. Other concepts that sort of tie into this, the sense of it being rugged, it's difficult to travel in, it's untamed, it's not, it's certainly not created by people, it's challenging, it's exotic. Exotic really just means foreign. And even though, the species that someone might find in the White Mountains were found throughout New England, coming from a more urbane place, or just an urban environment in general on the coast, the mountains were exotic. On the other hand, the notion of civilized that I'm going for here, remember that civilized is somewhat of a loaded word. It's not the anthropologists don't, and really anyone who studies culture in general doesn't use the word civilized anymore to mean sort of this hierarchy of human society, like we are civilized, they are uncivilized. But really, the way I'm using it is civilization is rooted in the city, right? This civil basically means city. And so when you are in the hotel, it is the utmost of civilization and high culture, right? So it's tamed, it's luxurious, it's comfortable, it's modern, it's classy, and it's accessible. You don't need your boots on to walk to the bar at the Mount Washington Hotel. So we're going to see a juxtaposition of both of these themes throughout cartography that I'll look at here, and especially with the tourism maps. So I have to start with a quote from the other Adam, who helped significantly donating maps and analysis of the maps for the exhibit. I've depended significantly on him. He's much more familiar with all the maps and cartography as in a historic sense of this area, and I use a lot of his ideas that come from whitemountainhistory.org, which has been the source of some of my images as well. What he notes about early cartography in the White Mountains is that essentially, as a whole, cartography in New Hampshire was pretty high quality. Because early on, like let's say 17th century, 18th century, because the British looked at New Hampshire as a frontier of resources, right? Of resources to be extracted and brought back to Europe, and so it was more important for them. It was important for them to have quality, accurate maps that revealed those resources. However, the White Mountains early on was far away from the colonial enterprise, right? And it was difficult to get resources out. Why would you worry about what's in the White Mountains when you have 100 miles of uncivilized forest, as they would see it at least, between the coast and the mountains? But eventually that comes to switch, right? The region held little commercial or political interest until the development of the first tourism. And then in a way, the value of New Hampshire in some ways switches, right? That the North becomes at least as valuable as the South. So I'm going to begin. The first actual map I'll use is the earliest surviving topographical map of the White Mountains from 1784 from Jeremy Belknap, early New Hampshire historian and of course namesake of Belknap County, famous granite stater. What we can see here, I'm gonna zoom in a couple on all these images. I'm gonna kind of zoom into some of the stuff that I find the most useful to explain what I'm saying. So this is a hand-drawn map. It is not it's not mass-produced. It's just his work one time, and you see the aged white paper and brown lines that illustrate generally, well, completely the rivers, and then there's a lot of text that supports the expression of space, right? So if you see in the middle, we have a big white space that says area of the White Mountains. In the future maps I'll show you, this dichotomy between like high detail and low detail will switch, right? So initially though, the White Mountains is sort of just a blank space that has a label. It really reminds me a lot of the very first representation, or the oldest representation of the White Mountains that we have, a textual at least, which came from Verrazano originally in the 16th century. High mountains among the land, or high mountains arise in the land. And so in a way, I think those two statements are so simple. They kind of they're kind of parallel. It's like there are mountains there, and here there are mountains there. Now around the mountains in a way are where we really get a sense of how to depict how Belknap is depicting the area. So if you look around, I don't know if my arrow will work here. What's written right here, and right here is what I'm going to go through. It says high inaccessible rocks. Right, that's what is right here. High inaccessible rocks, which are the Webster Cliffs, and high rocky mountains. These are, this text is spatially accurate. It is relative to where he would have been standing, but are really unique because they're sketched as a landscape, a view from a single point. They're sketched as a landscape from one perspective, right? So he's standing in one place and then sketching this, which is kind of an interesting way to represent it. It's like a point represented as a line and really as a drawing. You see this shaded areas, which are the drawing, and there's sort of this difficult, imposing, and visually stimulating terrain that he saw. And then beyond this, you have this blankness, which is in some ways, even though it has a name, it is like terra incognita or unknown lands. The wildness here is sort of imposing, and the civilized is really the only mark of civilization is essentially the rivers, assuming that he walked down the rivers. And then, if we look at back to the broader map of it, the rest of the white, like the blank space, is undifferentiated either as mountains, which are very inaccessible, or as valleys, which are unimportant. So white here is unique, or blankness, I should say. It represents both complete accessibility and complete inaccessibility. It's an interesting way to depict things. I think you could call it terra incognita versus terra facilis, or equals terra facilis. So the unknown lands are like the easy lands in this image. Okay, let's keep moving. So we're going to go forward about 5 years to Jeremy Belknap's map of, it's called A New Map of New Hampshire. This is a map of the whole state, and if you see on the right, I'm going to focus, zoom in on the White Mountains themselves. In this case, you can see these hash lines. These are cartographically known as hatchers. And in 1791, him using hatchers to illustrate topographical variation or elevation is pretty cutting edge way in cartography. It's a pretty cutting edge way to depict them, and in a lot of ways, I think you can see that it's a better way. It makes more sense in some ways, although it is kind of amoeba looking. I'm going to talk about these on several of the maps. The whole map, of course, it's not focused on the White Mountains, and so of course the White Mountains doesn't have as much detail. There's obviously less labeling, and it's also notably inaccurate. But if you look at the general, like the way your eyes catch this image, the bottom of the map looks very standard, right? It's places that you're familiar with, rivers, they're named. When you get to the White Mountains, you just have these strange blobs, right? And then the peaks of the blobs, the top, are empty. And this becomes a standard way of depicting the White Mountains, and I'm assuming and mountains all over the world. It was just a technique. But in a way, it's sort of chaotic and almost an eyesore. And so it really attaches your, it attracts your vision to this place and makes you wonder, hey, what's going on up there, right? And of course, he lived in the White Mountains, so in a way, it's a little surprising that his detail isn't focused on it. But again, I think per what Adam Apt says, it's because it was less important to the consumers of the map. So the next one I want to go through or discuss is, I'm fast forwarding significantly into the future here, but this image, which is called a bird's eye view from the summit of Mount Washington, White Mountains, New Hampshire, is one of the most unique maps of the White Mountains. And honestly, it's one of the most unique maps I've ever seen. It's also just incredibly beautiful. It's large. This map was shown in the exhibit. And it really uses this very unique focal point and to juxtapose, again, the wild and the civilized. So if you think of a map as a lens, right? If it has less distortion, perhaps the lens is flat. It could also be concave, showing the outside of the edges of the map in more focus, or it could be convex and showing the center of the map more focused. But in this case, the cartographers use this strange like sine wave of a lens. And so what you see in the middle is the top of Mount Washington, and the edges are essentially what you could see if you were standing there and did a 360-degree turn. This is not at all what, like if you go to Google Earth and get a direct bird's eye view of Mount Washington, you don't see any of this. In fact, you basically see the area that's right in the middle, surrounded by the clouds. What you see is that in this method makes the most civil place is in the wildest environment, right? And the edges, in a way, are sort of the calmest looking places, right? So if this is just sort of a screenshot from one of the edges, that the mountains fade both in color and in sort of strength back to the skyline, but in the middle, this is the zoomed in, all the different mountains. All the different structures on the top of Mount Washington, the Summit House, the Tip Top House, all the stables and things like that. And so the viewer's eyes are focused on that. It's concave in the middle and convex at the edges. It allows you to see the subject, which is the buildings, up close, while also seeing this distant periphery at the same time. It's really an incredible document. Adam Apt calls it, it's described, or says it's described as a bird's eye view, but it's more like a bird's eye view through a fisheye lens. So, yeah. That's a great one. I hope everybody got to see that. I'd love to see this technique on other mountains too. It's pretty fascinating. So now, since we're talking about the summit itself, the summits represent the strange microcosm of my claim of this juxtaposition of wild and civilized. And the reason that I say this is, because of what Mount Washington especially is known for, is this extremeness, right? The extreme weather, extreme winds, extreme elevation. And at the same time, we have, yet again, this opulent landscape, opulent buildings. This is the dining room from the Summit House. This is an image of around 1902, I think is what this one's from, of the railroad, the train that made it to the top, right? The steam train. And you see these fine gentlemen and ladies standing around discussing politics, perhaps. So this is this was the appeal of it, I believe, is that it was so far out and rugged, yet at the same time comfortable. In Stone Hotels of Mount Washington, there's an article that it's in Appalachia, that discusses the hotels. The author says, the building was not completely invulnerable to the mountain's weather. Skylights in the L leaked badly in the wind-driven rain, and keeping the water out was a frequent topic. 100-mile-an-hour winds caused the chandeliers to swing in arcs from their attachments, and window panes were blown out. often enough that the bellboys were practiced at replacing them with boards. Then, as now, lightning storms provided more excitement than was desirable. On one occasion, ball lightning danced through the kitchen, frightening the waitresses while a bolt turned the telegraph wires on the office ceiling into molten puddles on the floor. Quite a crazy place to be. At the same time, though, they had a telegraph, a parlor, functional indoor plumbing, electricity, a newspaper printer that printed a newspaper called Among the Clouds, stained glass, a bar, and of course, you know, especially in the 1880s, we had to separate lodging for staff and guests to keep the workers sort of in the background. So I hope you can understand how this strange place that comes out of this. The Fabyan House, certainly not as extreme of an environment, but especially this postcard that I have found, I think it really illustrates this rigid conformity and rigid, like, humanized space. Then the edge of the forest, where, you know, darkness and wildness and who knows what sorts of beasts are out there. Yet when you get into the dining room, we have this beautiful grand piano, lovely chandeliers, carpeting, and so forth, right at the doorstep of the wilderness. So one of the ways that people interpreted this, at least in the 19th century, was to market New Hampshire as the Switzerland of America. This is the image on the right is a souvenir and guidebook from 1920. It's a little later, but this phrase "Switzerland of America" could be found as early as 1875. And I think the reason that they marketed it that way is not only because of the sort of visual similarity, at least in the notches. The notches are pretty much the only place to me that looks like the Alps, but because Switzerland in many ways uses this same binary of incredible luxury in a rugged environment. So we see the Balsams in Dixwell Notch really looks quite similar to this. I just found this random hotel in Switzerland, Park Hotel Witznau. The architecture is similar, the landscape is similar, and so it made sense to compare it to Switzerland. And of course, Switzerland was a place that, at least among the elite, they already had an imagined geography of, and they probably knew about it. They may have actually been there. So giving them something to connect it to, and something that was similarly wild and civilized, was I believe a rational and useful way to create that imagined geography. Now we go to Leavitt, Franklin Leavitt, who's lived in 1824 to 98. And Franklin Leavitt is a local cartographer who lived, I believe, in Littleton. I may be wrong on that, but Leavitt Series are the first two published maps of the White Mountains. This is the second one, the second published one. Before this, they're just sort of sketches that we have. The thing that makes these maps special is that they are tourist maps. They are maps designed to create an imagined geography for tourists, right? And in a way, tourism is visitation for experience itself. It's been called travel without a purpose. The purpose is just the traveling itself and the being there. And so what a tourist map does is give you a sense of what you can see when you are there. If you've never heard about it, you can have a sense of what it's for. So when we look at this map, it's kind of unique in that it switches our normal point of view, where we're looking south. South is on the top. It has some strange different perspectives, especially if you look at these the mountains down through the notch that are basically leaning the other directions. But it's centered on the presidential range, no surprise there, although it strangely depicts Mount Webster as larger than Mount Washington. So if I can get my pointer here, there we go. Here's Mount Washington here. This is Webster over here. And again here, like earlier maps, the mountains are shaded and very differentiated. But if you look at the image, they are presented as the subject that catches your viewer's glance against a fairly blank background, right? That I called sort of terra facilis. It's the easy place. It's not, we're not concerned with it. It's not the focus. This map, in a way, begins the tradition in White Mountains cartography of including beautiful pictures of the hotels. But we also have this sort of action going on, a man shooting, well, something. I'm guessing from Leavitt's future maps that this is intended on, or perhaps it used to be an image of a bear. That's old Crawford shooting a bear, but in a way you can't really tell what's happening in this, in what's left of this image. And you see, so again, we have this sort of the mountains jump out at you. That's the focus. The background is sort of not important, but there's this wildness next to it, right? Then we have all of the transportation, right? The railroads and the rivers. They all kind of, to me, it looks almost like a spider's web that leads you to the mountains, where you're kind of captured as prey for the visitors. And then yet the blank space is sort of no challenge at all. If we go to Leavitt's next series, and this is 1859, a few years later, he's returned to or maybe not returned to, but he's using our more standard north to south orientation here. But in a way that the image looks quite similar to the previous one, except it's more artistic. It's made, it's got a lot more action than the first version of this map. The mountains are also a lot more humanized. They're more interesting. They're where all the action takes place. He does include several of the hotels that are roughly sited at their location, but then we have a few other events going on here. So, you know, peaceful, civilized hotel, then Crawford shooting a bear, Dr. Ball lost 3 days in the snow, Willie family tragedy, where Chandler died, and then next to it, there are comfortable carriage rides, there is sublime nature, where the chaos and destruction are sort of held at arm's length. When I look at this image, it's almost like a story, right? It's as if you could take an elegant cruise ship through a Wild West novel, right? You safely can consume the struggles and the rugged elements and the human tragedy from, you know, from your recliner in a way. It seems like an effective way to attract visitation. All right, the last Leavitt map I'll show is 1879, which this is not a published map, it's a manuscript, but I have to include it because it really reiterates that he was really trying to get this you know, rugged mountains, wildness, yet look at all these wonderful hotels. He has these rough drawings of a man in a stovepipe hat with a rifle. There's another picture of a man shooting what I'm guessing is a bear, but kind of looks like a hog, but it's not it's just a manuscript. It's not a published map. But he really, it shows me that he was really dedicated to this idea of this way of representing New Hampshire. Now, Franklin Leavitt also wrote poetry about the White Mountains, and really the only reason I include this is because, again, he sticks to this same story. Yeah, the poetry maintains the fascination with this drama and the ruggedness amongst civilization. Poems about disasters, the Willie tragedy, Cherry Mountain landslides, and sings the praise of the hotels, the tourist hotels, the Glen House, the profile houses. And so he likes this mode of the story about White Mountains. Now, Tantum wrote an article in 1979 about Leavitt's poetry, and he calls it clumsy. It's kind of folksy, I suppose, is the word for it. But as he says, useful to the study of the development of the White Mountains as a tourist region in the 19th century. So he was really interested in selling this place to people or attracting visitors in general. Okay, now I'm going to fast forward to a map producer that we are all much more aware of, the AMC. This AMC 1887 map is really a beautiful. It's a beautiful image. It's very high detailed. I have to zoom in pretty far. This is one that doesn't have a lot of exaggerations of scale, whereas we've seen a lot of exaggeration of scale in the previous ones, and we will in the future. We see Hatchard Mountains here, and interspersed though are blank valleys. So especially this image I've brought up, I think it's kind of telling. You look on the left, you see Bethlehem, right? And obviously that's the real name of the town. But in some ways it works perfectly to say, like, here we have, you know, the most peaceful, sacrosanct place in the Christian world, right? Bethlehem. And then if you follow to the east, you get a valley that narrows and narrows and narrows. And finally, you are at Mount Deception. You are at the White Mountain House, where all chaos ensues beyond that, unless you're walking right next to the river. And so again, I can see this flow from civilization to wild in this one. Next, I'll show, I want to talk about the 1882 Boston Concord and Maine railroad promotional map. Now, railroad maps, of course, had a huge impact on travel, and they are by all means tourism marketing. If you can, and it's just like watching a commercial today about from an airline. And what we see here is a deep Hatchard map that is interspersed with blank valleys. Excuse me, I've gotten a little confused here on my notes. Okay, excuse me, 1852. Okay, right. So this image comes from a White Mountain guidebook. Obviously, a really great place to put a railroad map, because that's how you're going to have to get there. Dark mountain hatchers, and it includes the bald tops. Now, the bald tops are used to illustrate essentially that this is where the elevation stops changing. But I think if you look at it, right, visually in a simplistic way, it almost looks like that's where the peace is. Chaos to get there, and then you reach the top, you've conquered it, and it's a peaceful place to be. And it begs the viewer to look more closely. Now, this one especially is kind of daunting, right? You could get to the top of that mountain, but you have to be a hardy adventurer, right? The peaks are peaceful solace. They are a reward for the intrepid traveler. When we look at the Boardman map, another beautiful map. This is the map that my initial image came from. You see that the hotels are drawn in, as has become standard practice at this point in tourist maps. They're really high detailed image. The images of the hotels are, are accurate landscapes, or at least accurate romantic landscapes. But you still see the use of hatchers on the mountains, the bald peaks at the top, what, to me, this one really, it draws the viewer to both the mountains and the hotels equally, and it does it in an elegant way that makes both of them seem somewhat accessible. Of course, it still does use the blank space, the terra facilis, the easy land that doesn't make, that's not attraction. And so it's focusing on the opulence and the wildness at the same time. We see that's essentially that same, I mean, it is the geographic reality of that valley from Bethlehem to Mount Washington. So they use it here, though, the same situation, that kind of narrowing valley into chaos. But in this case, we have the profile house as a, as the source of the civilization, and then the rest of the, then it sort of bleeds out into total chaos at the mountains. It's not exactly chaos, but it's darkness in a way, in a material sense. So then I'm going to move to the B&M Railroad promotional map. This is the second promotional map, and I've got to say it's a lot more beautiful in a map than the previous one that I showed, the previous railroad promotional map. When you look at this one, it is, there we go. The mountains and the features overall here, below the skyline, are really endless in a way. Like if you kind of blurred your eyes, it just looks like chaos of lines, right? But the subject, which is of course the railroad itself, is overscaled, and it really sticks out. It begs the viewer to really look closely at the undifferentiated areas, which is what I've done here when we zoom in. That you can desire them, right? You can go to Mount Dartmouth, you can go to Mount Clinton. That it uses really small representations of the hotels, so in a way they are closer to scale, although they're certainly still upscaled. But I think what this map accomplishes is you look at this sort of chaos, this wildness, and you know that you can get there, you desire it, and the way that you get there, guess what, is on the B&M Railroad, right? So it draws you in, but it convinces you that the way to get there is to buy a ticket. And it's a pretty functional map. It's kind of difficult to read, but I think that's on purpose so that the viewer would have to look at it a little bit more closely and realize how to get there. The last one I want to use is this fascinating piece from 1886 from Morris that is titled, it's titled Bird's Eye View of the Wild Mountains, but it's sort of subtitle, or it was marketed as the most perfect map ever issued. It's a beautiful image. This is one of the only ones that I found that actually does shade in the areas that are not the focus, right? The far background where you can see the town of Whitefield and Lancaster. So they're not presented as nothing, but by all means, it does highlight the mountains. The mountains are overscaled. The roads and the roads and the railroads and the rivers they stick out. They're easy to see, and when you zoom in, you do still have the hotels that are accurately located, although by all means overscaled. So this was actually sold as a folded paper, a folded sort of envelope, and the words "the most perfect map ever issued" were printed on the outside with a photograph of the old man for 25 cents. Why is it the most perfect map ever issued? I can't answer, but I do think it's beautiful, and I think it does a good job of illustrating the accessibility of these wild places. So to summarize, to kind of move to today, I believe that this juxtaposition of wild and civilized still is the imagined geography of the White Mountains. And so to prove this is a common tactic I use in class. I did a Google image search for the phrase White Mountains, New Hampshire vacation. And this is what comes up. So if you look at these 10 images, we see first a very comfortable ski lodge, that's civilized, a house in the middle of the woods, civilized and wild, a road this is the auto road, Mount Washington Auto Road, accessibility, wildness in the background, the Mount Washington Hotel, which is all civilization. Then the next image of a resort, civilization, the Riverwalk, civilized. The only one that comes up that sort of doesn't fit this paradigm is this picture of Wellsdale, this kid on the tube. But a picture of a porch, a safe, easy place with wildness in the background, then a picture of wildness, then a picture of wildness. So the character of these pictures still fits this back and forth. We are still civilized and wild, or luxury and wild. And I think that the maps, the early maps, have made a huge impact on why that is. It does beg the question, in a way, when I meant to talk about this with regard to Leavitt. Leavitt was attempting to attract tourists. He used ideas that he thought would attract tourists, but it begs the question of, does the market produce the representation, or does the representation produce the market? By all means, this is a feedback loop, in that when people think that it is civilized and wild, or whatever their understanding of a place is, when people think that it's that way, and then marketers reproduce that, then the representations meet the market needs, and the market expectations meet the representations. And so this is in a way why these imagined geographies stick, I think, is that there's this constant feedback loop about what we think about places. And then we go out and actually build that, right? We go out and create it. So thank you for listening. Hopefully there's not a lot of lag time. The summary in general: wild and civilized became a geographic imaginary in the White Mountains around the time that cartographers began producing maps to attract tourists. This is when it began. And then in the long run, as tourism came to dominate the economy, cartographers reproduced this imaginary and its expectations through various artistic methods in their maps. Some beautiful, some a little bit clunky, but they reproduced it nonetheless. So thank you for your attendance. I apologize for the first iteration's failures, but I hope it's probably a little more practice now. Keep it wild and civil, and special thanks to Adam Apt for all of his knowledge and wisdom on this, and for helping us with the maps, and for his comments that he's made since the first attempt at this. Big thanks to whitemountainshistory.org. I got a lot of information from there. Obviously, great thanks to the staff and the folks that fund the Museum of the White Mountains, because we can't do it without you. Thanks.